You wouldn't believe how often we hear Americans compare Portugal to different states in the US. It's like a national pastime with Americans abroad. For example, it's really common to hear people say that Portugal is like California because of the weather, or Portugal is like Indiana because of the general shape and land area. We did some research and found that there's actually one state that draws a lot of parallels. Now, before you throw your arms up, we know nothing like this is perfect because Portugal is in Europe and not in the US, and there are a tremendous amount of variables or factors that can be compared. But let's take a closer look and you'll see how Portugal and South Carolina are similar. This will be fun, right? First up, let's chat about population. Portugal has around 10.3 million people, which would be most similar to Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, as all three of those states have 10 million people. However, South Carolina has about half the population of Portugal at 5.3 million people, but Portugal is 17th out of 51 countries considered to be in Europe, with Vatican City being 51 with 800 people. South Carolina is 23rd in terms of population in the US, so both Portugal and the Palmetto State are smack dab in the middle in terms of population for their respective regions. If Portugal were a state, it would be the 10th most populous, just ahead of Michigan. Not too shabby, right? Speaking of people though, Portugal's foreign-born population is 7.5% and South Carolina's is 5.2%, which isn't worlds apart. Although Nebraska is the closest state to Portugal at 7.4% non-native population, which is still well under the national average of foreign-born population, as the US has 13.6% of its population being born outside of the country. And fun fact, the US takes the crown as the world's top destination for immigration with a whopping 50.6 million non-native residents. Impressive, yeah? The US also has around 3 million immigrants. However, this number, according to the State Department, is really hard to peg down exactly. Now here's the kicker for you. Portugal has around 1 million immigrants and 2 million immigrants. Yep, more Portuguese are living outside of Portugal than there are foreigners living in the country. Mind-boggling, isn't it? Did you know that South Carolina has 8,889 Portuguese Americans, which is close to the same number of Americans living in Portugal as of 2022? Okay, back to Portugal and South Carolina. Portugal's land area is 92,225 kilometers square, and South Carolina is the 40th largest state in the US with a land area of close to 83,000 kilometers square. Slightly larger than South Carolina and closer to Portugal's size is Maine at 91,633 kilometers square. Indiana, which has a similar shape and size to Portugal, has a percentage of area covered by water similar to Portugal at 1.63 compared to Portugal's 1.2%. Now, South Carolina is a bit different here with 6.12% of its area covered by H2O. The closest land area covered by water compared to Portugal is Idaho at 1.11%. Now let's not forget that Portugal's coastline is a big deal, shaping its economy and lifestyle. States without coastlines just can't compete when you consider land area and population. South Carolina has two competing numbers when it comes to looking at the coastline. Some sites say it has 2,876 miles of coastline, but surely this is including all of the tiny islands and such that make up the coastline. It's more likely to be 190 to 200 miles if you draw a straight line from the north to the south. We found competing numbers for Portugal too, but it seems like there are 823 kilometers along the Atlantic coast, which is the same body of water as South Carolina. For comparison, Louisiana's coastline might be the closest to matching Portugal's, but it's far less. And it's a big jump from Louisiana when you're talking about Hawaii, California, Florida, and Alaska. Now, North Carolina could also draw comparisons to Portugal because of the Atlantic coast, long slender shape, and the fact that Charlotte and Lisbon metro areas are similar in population size. However, North Carolina really blows Portugal out of the water with the next criteria, and South Carolina is much more similar, but again, not perfect. Portugal's GDP compared to South Carolina is pretty close. Portugal has 16.4% of its population below their poverty line. South Carolina has 13.8% below the US poverty line. Portugal has 6.1% unemployment versus South Carolina's 3.2%. Portugal and South Carolina both have their historical connections to slave trade, and they were on opposite ends of colonialism, but that's not a surprise because a lot of the east coast of the USA was a colony. To this day, both Portugal and South Carolina have very active ports that have a large impact on the economy. All right, this will get a bit tricky here, but hear me out. If we go by the Köppen climate classification, Portugal is divided into two different classifications, CSA and CSB. CSB climates are found in the north and the west coast of Portugal, which is most like the Pacific Northwest USA and California. CSA is found in the interior of Portugal, which is also like the interior of California and also parts of Arizona. Across the majority of South Carolina, it's still the C category in the Köppen climate classification, but it is a humid subtropical climate. Like Portugal, South Carolina's winters are mild. Portugal and California get compared a lot, and it makes sense to some degree, because the climate in San Francisco is comparable to Porto, and if you go further south in California, you find LA, which has a similar year-round climate to Lisbon. They both have their coastline on the west, and a longer shape than compared to South Carolina. If we take a closer look at the topography of South Carolina and Portugal, we find similarities in the elevation of the two and how they both fall to sea level as you move diagonally across the area. What you'll have to do is flip South Carolina as its mountainous region is in upstate starting in the northwest, whereas Portugal starts in the northeast. I know we just spoke about California, and if you want to get high, let's talk about Portugal's average elevation. It sits at 372 meters, which would rank it 21st in the US in terms of average elevation. South Carolina is one of the lower states in the US at 110 meters, or 44th. Sure, these comparisons aren't perfect, but before we get too subjective, here's something interesting. Portugal has nuts. Not those nuts, but these nuts. The first division is continental Portugal and then the two island regions. The second division shows 7, but let's remove the two island regions because they are quite unique. And let's look at what's continental. There are 5. South Carolina also can be divided into 3 main regions. The next classification is divided into 4, upstate, Midlands, PD, and Low Country. Upstate is the mountainous region in the north, which is comparable to the north of Portugal. Now here's something confusing. South Carolina's capital, Columbia, isn't the largest city by population, but it is centrally located in the state. If you look, it really appears to be central and most major interstates go through Columbia. The same cannot be said about the state's most populous city, Charleston. If you think about Lisbon, almost all major highways go to Lisbon. It too is centrally located and it's more coastal in orientation, which is similar to Charleston. No city in South Carolina is massive, but Charleston has 153,040 people, and the third most populous city in the state is North Charleston, which, no surprise, is just north of Charleston. There's also Mount Pleasant, which could be compared to Sintra. We've already explored the population on a macro level, so it's no surprise that both Charleston's and Mount Pleasant are 3 times smaller. Charleston, like Lisbon, has some serious historical value. Charleston earned a spot on a worldwide list for best vacation destinations in the world and was ranked the #1 destination for a trip within the United States, according to results on Travel and Leisure. Even crazier, on Travel and Leisure readers' rankings of favorite cities in the world in 2023, Charleston ranks 19th and Lisbon 20th. By the way, Porto's 24th on this list. Out of all the states in the US, South Carolina is right up there with historical buildings, which for anyone that's traveled around Portugal knows that in the old cities, the architectural style is preserved. The food scene and variety in South Carolina is good and somewhat regional, just like Portugal. Different areas of Portugal are famous for their local dishes like cataplana in the south, amigos com carne or assorda de alentejana from Alentejo, and bacalhau à Braga in the north. There are so many more foods that we could list here. South Carolina has its regional foods too though. Frogmore stew or low country boil, which is another name of the same thing, which comes from, you guessed it, the low country. But there's also gullah red rice from the low country, which is pretty similar to arroz de tomate, which you can find in many traditional restaurants across Portugal. In PD, you'll find chicken bog, which is a stodgy rice dish. The Midlands also has a rice dish called hash and rice, which has its origins revolving around economy, being a poor man's food, not too different than the tripas à moda do Porto. The wild thing to know about South Carolina's barbecue is that there are 3 different types that exist across the state in different regions, with the most unique being the golden or the mustard sauce barbecue, which is a more Midlands thing compared to the ketchup tomato based sauces of upstate or the vinegar based barbecue of the low country. There are more food comparisons to make, and let's be honest, there are some states in the US that have foods that are more like Portugal because of their high number of Portuguese Americans living there. Hello, Massachusetts and New Jersey. But for the regional variety that exists and the fact that both South Carolina and Portugal are underrated by people that just haven't experienced their foods, it's a good comparison. Here's something that's a subjective feeling, but people have been polled about it and the rankings are out. In Europe, Portugal ranks number 2, just behind Ireland for having the friendliest people in Europe. Well, guess what? South Carolina is ranked number 3 in the US for its friendliness, living up to its name of smiling faces, beautiful places. From its size, climate, topography, economy, variety of food, and friendly people, Portugal is most like South Carolina overall. Subscribe if you're interested in learning more about Portugal, especially if you're considering moving here. You can search our channel for a wide range of topics that will help you make your move. If you're not done watching videos yet, see why YouTube recommends you watch this video next. And until next time, let's get moving. Bye.